You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. We'll have more news this evening, but first...
The latest Gene-ology, a Roddenberry podcast.
Episode 29, Exile. Welcome to Mission Log Gene-ology. I'm Earl Green.
And I'm Norman Lau.
Each week on Gene-ology, we explore the early TV writing of Gene Roddenberry, years before he created Star Trek, looking for signs of the socially relevant messages he was famous for working into his creations.
And this week, we conclude our coverage of Gene Roddenberry's second, unpublished and unseen script for Warrior, The Life of Sam Houston, titled Exile. Earl will be back with trivia in a moment, but first, here's how you can reach us. Gene-ology is meant to be entertaining and informative, but it's also the beginning of an ongoing conversation about the works of Gene Roddenberry. Drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com and join us on X and Facebook at missionlogpod. While you're at it, leave us a review and a rating at Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And please remember your comments could be used on future installments of Gene-ology. And now, here's Earl Green, who's returned from research exile with this week's trivia.
Thank you, Norman. I hope my horse fares better than Sam's in this script. Exile is a second script written for Gene's unproduced Sam Houston series that he was developing between 1957 and 58 for Screen Gems, and it's probably safe to assume that the script can be narrowed down to early 1958. So again, we have a Gene script that has been seen by very few eyes, and it was certainly news to us. But that's not all that's fascinating here. There's more markup by hand and margin notes and corrections in Gene's own handwriting than we have encountered in any script to date, mainly in the first 7 or 8 pages of the script. What did you think of that, Norm? Was this more markup than you've seen in anything we've gotten to so far?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to bring up some specific questions as to reference the possibility of why.
Yeah, it's kind of mystifying, and without any supporting correspondence, we are, unfortunately, kind of left to speculate. So in the first 7 or 8 pages of the script, you have entire scenes crossed out by hand, in some cases very vigorously blacked out, which meant trying to read around or through Gene's markouts. There are 2 pages of the script that just have a giant X crossing out the entire page. So there's definitely a sense that this was a work in progress and possibly, sadly, a work abandoned. But surely that is a sign of hope for any of you listening who have your own occasionally frustrating creative endeavors. Because for every sketch you've been tempted to wad up the paper and throw away, for every spec script you've started and then set aside, just know this stuff happened to Gene Roddenberry, too. It could be that abandoned ideas in this script informed later scripts for Have Gun Will Travel or another show, and we'll start covering Have Gun next week, so stick around. We'll all find this out together in real time. And in the meantime, however frustrating it gets, don't give up on your dreams, because Gene certainly didn't. One more amusing thing is that the very last page of the document includes a self-addressed registered mail envelope. This is what's known as the poor man's copyright registration. You mail a copy of your script to yourself, and the postmark is proof of the date. The problem is that doesn't legally hold water as a copyright registration, and yet Gene was far from the only person ever to do this. The proper way to do this is, now, if you're a member of the Writers Guild for either coast, you register the script with your guild local. But, hey, I get it. Gene was a busy man. A lot of scripts to write, a family that needed his attention, and of course, all of that all-important after-hours networking within the fraternity, and at this time it was mostly a fraternity of fellow TV writers. The sad irony is, the part of the envelope that might have tipped us off to the date this was written is absent. So, to paraphrase Chicago, we're left with question 57 or 58.
Item: the matter of payment for both Creek and Cherokee land given up in Tennessee and Georgia. No money has been received. Livestock delivered has only been...
Mr. Houston, the name is Burnett, head of the Department of Indian Affairs.
And these are the ambassadors of the 7 Indian nations. Since you didn't show us the courtesy of meeting us, your interruption now isn't surprising.
Major? The department doesn't deal with renegades, sir, or criminals.
I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of John Crossett, Morgan Burke, and the probable murder of Thomas Powers, Indian agent in the federal territory of...
Those men were killed under Cherokee law for the hanging of the 3 tribe members.
Unless you can furnish proof.
I'm not required to furnish proof to you, sir. The Treaty of 1827 gives us the right to enforce our own laws.
The man's a liar. No Indians were hung. It was out and out murder.
Barrington, how much was Powers paid you?
If you weren't afraid to act like a white man, I'd take that as a challenge.
It was meant to be exactly that.
Prologue. Nashville, Tennessee, 1829. A lynch mob, complete with torches, gathers at the center of town, with a large crowd cheering them on. Fortunately, their victim is a dummy and not a human being. Unfortunately, the dummy is standing in for who they'd like to be hanging, and a sign attached to the dummy makes it clear who they are hanging by proxy. Sam Houston, coward. Sam Houston happens to be the governor of Tennessee, so it would seem he has fallen just ever so slightly out of favor with his constituents. The exit poll is in, and this crowd wants Houston to exit. The point of contention seems to be that the governor got married and then left his new bride 10 days later, and in an election year, will no one think of the optics? A member of Houston's cabinet watches from the governor's mansion and gets into an argument with another politician about Sam's fitness to hold office. Then Sam Houston himself enters the room. He has a prepared statement, but when some of his political allies suggest throwing Mrs. Houston under the metaphorical bus, Sam's not having it. Anyone who questions her character will answer to him. Sam's statement is simple. He has no statement to make. It's a private matter. Oh, and Sam's resigning as governor. No big deal. His staff is stunned. He prepares to leave the governor's mansion and brave the crowd outside, but is warned they may not be in a mood to let him pass. He wryly says, "You know what they say about dogs, gentlemen. Those are the barking kind out there." And he's right. The crowd parts for him as he leaves. Act 1. On horseback, Houston strikes out west from Tennessee and into Arkansas, where he meets up with a band of Cherokees. Among them is Houston's foster father, Ulutika. Weary from his recent ordeal and his travels, Sam Houston has come home. But this meeting is observed from a distance by 2 men in army uniforms. Around the campfire at night, Sam strips out of the clothing of the governor of Tennessee and throws them into the fire, before being handed Indian clothes by a Cherokee woman, Tiana, who Sam knew years ago when he joined the tribe. Ulutika welcomes his son, the Raven, back to the tribe and says that his political misfortunes are the work of the Great Spirit. The Cherokees need Sam's wisdom, his strength, and perhaps most importantly, his knowledge of the white man's world right now. A voice speaks out from the crowd. "Oh, hey, Tucky, you're still here." Tucky represents the Pawnees, and he says he has come to seek Ulutika's wisdom, not the wisdom of a white man wearing Indian clothing. But Ulutika is having none of that. He tells Tucky, God painted all hearts the same color. And to make his point, Sam takes off the boots in which he walked in the white man's world and throws them into the fire. Tucky points out that the goods that white settlers have promised in exchange for Indian land have been a no-show, and to get straight to the question, he asks Sam if the tribes should be expected to starve out silently or fight back, declaring war on those who have taken their land and given them nothing in return. Sam warns that words spoken in peace are stronger than knives used in anger. Predictably, Tucky is not impressed. Ulutika agrees with Sam, however, and he believes Sam should be the one to bring this up with the nearest Indian agent and talk them into upholding their side of the treaty. By day, Sam rides into Fort Smith to meet with Major Barrington, who heads up the Army's presence there. On the border of Arkansas and Oklahoma, the fort is the frontier between tribal territory and the land now occupied by white settlers. Also present in Barrington's office are Powers, the local Indian agent, and a thuggish man named Burke. They anticipate Sam Houston's arrival with a disdain reserved for, as Powers puts it, Indian lovers. And Barrington and Powers have already gotten some intel from a young Cherokee they've captured and interrogated. When Houston is sighted approaching the fort, the young Cherokee escapes. Turns out intel can flow both ways. Houston, seeing that the boy has been beaten, sends him homeward before dismounting his horse and walking the rest of the way to Barrington's office. Sam is greeted with insults that make it clear his resignation as the governor of Tennessee is now known far and wide. Sam doesn't take the bait and cuts to the chase, turning the conversation toward the treaty. But Barrington and Powers stonewall him and lie to his face. Sam keeps pressing the matter, and it gets ugly, a fight in which he is against every other man in the room. It doesn't go well for Sam. Act 2. Sam has returned to the tribe to heal from the brutal beating he took from Powers and Barrington and their men. Also recovering is young Elder, the boy who was captured and escaped from Fort Smith. Young Elder wants revenge. Sam has a better idea. Under cover of night, and in accordance with Indian law, he and the tribe take back their own tribe's horses and cattle, which are penned up at Fort Smith. The result? Public disgrace for Powers. It turns out bad news doesn't just travel fast from Tennessee. And Sam's campaign continues. The tribe returns another night to set fire to the hut where the furs they've traded are stored. It sucks to be Powers. There is an unprecedented meeting of tribal chiefs in Indian Territory. Leaders of the Creek, Delaware, Choctaw, Pawnee, and Osage tribes are in Cherokee Territory not to fight the other tribes, but to coordinate their efforts against the settlers. It's a war, but so far, it's a quiet one. That war has been recognized for what it is by the president. Andrew Jackson himself writes a letter to Sam urging him not to be reckless enough to break completely from his own kind. Houston sees a glimmer of hope in this letter and tells the assembled tribal leaders that he will go to Washington to negotiate directly with the president rather than dealing with men like Powers and Barrington. And if those negotiations fail, then and only then is it war. But Tuckey wants to see a demonstration of adherence to Cherokee law, not the white man's law. He demands to see Sam slay one of their enemies. Sam refuses, but the next day 3 dead Cherokees are found hung from the trees, the work of Powers and his thugs. Despite this, Sam asks the tribes to pick their ambassadors for the negotiations ahead. Sam spots the trail of the men who did this and follows them alone. Act 3. Sam catches up with Powers and Burke, who immediately open fire on him, hitting and killing Sam's horse. Pinned down by his mount, Sam is trying to free himself while shots continue to ring out around him. Sam escapes into hiding, unarmed, with 3 men in pursuit. Sam frightens off their horses to even the odds. Now everyone is on foot. Burke is taken out with a thrown tomahawk. 1 down, 2 to go. But Powers won't give up. He says, "I want Houston." But his surviving guard replies, "I kinda think he wants us, too." Sam fashions a spear and takes out the other man. Now it's just him and Powers. And Powers goes into hiding, where he is bitten by a rattlesnake. Maybe this fight has been settled by the Great Spirit, after all. Washington, D.C., January 18th, 1830. Sam Houston doesn't ride into town. The Raven does, with the leaders of 7 tribes behind him. But there's another familiar face in town. Hello, Barrington. Heated words are exchanged, and Barrington is spoiling for a fight. But no one's here to talk to Barrington. They are here at the invitation of the President of the United States. After those negotiations are formally opened, Sam decides to take Barrington up on his offer, but he does so as Sam Houston, former governor of Tennessee. It's not a fight that Barrington wins, and worse yet, he and others are to be held responsible by the federal government for their actions in Arkansas. President Jackson suggests that Sam could be of use to him in Texas. It's a job offer Sam Houston will take under consideration. The end.
Fantastic recap, Earl. There's a lot in this script. For a script that I think I pointed out to you early on with a great chuckle, that is 47 pages from cover to cover. 47, folks, as you know, if you're listening to the standard mission log, with John Champion and myself, that is one of the things that we bring up all the time, and it's part of our tradition. And as much as I love this script, I love the fact that there are only 47 pages in total, even more.
You know, for all the grief we give the Voyager writers about the sheer number of times that 47 shows up, now I guess we've got to let them off the hook, because Gene's here with the first 47.
I'm glad you brought up Gene, because there's something that I thought was really interesting as I was breaking down the script. There are a lot of handwritten notes, as you said, in trivia. And this is the first time that I think I've really just kind of been exposed to so much either self-editing or complete deletions of pages. In the first 9 pages alone, 2, 3, 4, and half of 5 are gone, like just X'd out. Just not even like I'm going to change this word, or I'm going to rearrange the order of the dialogue. They're just big X. So this isn't a shooting script, which means these are Gene's edits. It dawned on me for the first time on air, we're talking about Gene self-editing his own scripts, reading notes that probably no one, aside from a handful of people and us talking about it right now, haven't seen in 67 years.
Yeah, there were a couple of times that stopped me up short. It's like, whoa, that's Gene's writing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, these are not someone else's edits, which really makes me wonder, if there is no further draft of this script, did it ever get sent to anyone? Did anyone else ever actually see it? Did he submit it to Screen Gems, or did he say, let's send him the other one?
Or what would he have written in the stead of those 2.5, 3 pages that were completely deleted?
Well, it could be that he sat back and read it to himself out loud, as you do, to kind of time things out, and came to the conclusion that it's a little top-heavy at the front. Because, really, you have that narration at the beginning of Act 1, basically repeating what we already know from the cold open, that Sam has left the post of governor of Tennessee in public disgrace. Now, it could also be that Gene decided that the story of Houston leaving his wife after 10 days, which that is part of the historical record, and the public reaction to it is also part of the historical record. None of this is being made up for dramatic purposes. It could be that he decided that needed to be its own story, or perhaps it was a distraction if it was part of this story.
Yeah, that's fair. It's really difficult to know, obviously, since the only person that would have known, there are no notes left from him in this script at all. So what I do like, though, in the opening scenes that you were talking about in your recap, it was the hanging of Sam Houston in effigy. And I'm wondering if we can speculate that these pages were whittled down just because they just got a little too controversial, even for Gene.
That is entirely possible because, unfortunately, and I am probably going to be overusing the word unfortunately quite a lot today, there were still acts like this being perpetrated on just about anyone could find whose skin wasn't white at this point in history. And I have some thoughts on that Gene is not just writing a story about Native Americans here. He is using this episode in history to address much more contemporary things. And I have a feeling someone broke out in a cold sweat over that in the boardroom. Now, on a lighter note, I did get a chuckle about how Sam Houston's doctor, his staff physician, shows up to vouch for his physical and moral health. I didn't even know you could measure that.
Doctors could do a lot back then, from what I understand.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, I'd love to see the coursework, the part of the PhD that covers that.
Right.
There is a line that Sam Houston utters It is no part of the conduct of a gallant or generous man to take up arms against a woman. If my character cannot stand the shock, then let me lose it. That is an actual, historically documented quote from Huston himself on this occasion. And it is the first, but definitely not the last time, Gene leaves a note in the script. Don't change a word of this. This is what was actually said.
One of the biggest difficulties in breaking down the script is there is a chunk of certain scenes where almost every other line was significant. Like there's a line of dialogue also that made me kind of like stop in my tracks and say, this is impressive. Sam says to Tucky in this conversation when the Indian nations were under the consul of Luteka, and Sam says, when anger takes a man's humor, it leaves foolishness in its place. I smile because power's whip beat weakness from my heart. I came to the Cherokee with my blood thin, full of pity for myself. The whip gave me my strength back again. That, to me, when anger takes a man's humor, it leaves foolishness in its place. It's just so monumentally Gene. Just the way it sounds and feels.
Yeah.
I might be actually using monumentally just abusively throughout the course of the rest of my recap for this episode.
Yeah, I wonder if that is an exact quote from Sam Huston, or if that's a Gene original. What's really interesting is that Gene has found himself a sort of kinship across the ages with a historical figure here. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of interesting trying to separate historical record from what was invented for the script.
No, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm not sure exactly where that line is being drawn when it comes to the script.
Yeah. After the gathering of the tribal chiefs, when Tucky, being Tucky again, he wants to see Sam kill a white man, in accordance with tribal law. Well, I give him this. Tucky is pretty consistent. He is, for a warrior, he sure does a lot of his work with words and trying to outmaneuver his opponent. Mm-hmm. Now, here's a question. Do we disregard Destiny and the Raven? Or do we read Exile as a story in the same continuum? Because either one of these could be the series pilot. The reason I bring that possibility up is that if you remember, when Star Trek was originally proposed to Desilu, there were 3 or 4 episodes presented as possible pilots, including The Cage and, bizarrely, The Omega Glory. Evidently, this was just something you did at the time. You didn't write one pilot. You wrote 2 or 3 and said, hey, pick one, to the studio. Obviously, historically speaking, yes, these are characters in one long-running storyline. And I wrote the recap assuming Destiny happened, and that Tucky is up to his usual tactics, especially because our listeners just heard about him last week. So I will admit that that's a bit of artistic license on my part. There's no indication in the script that, in this script for Exile, that Tucky and Sam Huston have been at odds for years.
I think what's most interesting about these 2 scripts, Destiny and the Raven and Exile, is that we're dealing with a time period that dealt with, I believe it was 1817 in the first script, and 1829 in the second script. So given what you are saying about how Gene submitted the first 2 or 3 pilot scripts to Desilu, I think it was actually smart that he created 2 completely separate timelines, if you will. The same Sam Huston timeline, but 2 different eras of his career, where he's the rough and tumble action-adventure Sam Huston, and then you have more of kind of like the seasoned diplomat Sam Huston in this episode, where he knows far more than even like the U.S. government realizes about Indian affairs and law. So if they picked up one or the other, then I think that, you could always either treat one as a flashback episode, since Destiny was in 1816 or 1817, and then this one, if this was the first episode, it would be present day, would be like the Sam Houston that we know. That's why I think when we brought up like the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles in the last episode, it was really important because that's a format they could have done.
Yeah, they could have had 2 or 3 Sam Houstons cast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although you have to keep in mind, there was a flashback episode of Have Gun where we saw the origin story of Paladin.
Right.
And they didn't hire a different actor. It was still Richard Boone. They didn't even try to de-age him or anything like, de-aging him, it meant something different then than it does now. Now you do it with computers. Back then, you just cake on the makeup a bit more. They weren't going to cast a younger Paladin. You've already got Richard Boone on the payroll. How dare you?
I think there was less expectation of that kind of execution then.
Yeah.
As compared to now. It was like, of course, this is just the story. So I think as entertaining as that would have been, it doesn't really impact. It may have been it would adversely impact if you didn't see, Richard Boone, your star.
Yeah.
In the show, regardless, except for if he was like a teenager or a baby, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Babies might look good with Richard Boone's mustache. You never know.
Lizard babies would look good with that mustache.
There you go.
There is a line where Sam is talking with Ulutika that really, really got me. Again, is this a Gene original, or is this from the historical record? Does evil change with skin color, my father? That line right there convinced me more than anything that this story, and of course, the historical incidents that Gene is drawing from to write this story, may be about First Nations peoples. But Gene is using it to address a far wider issue.
So there's a scene towards the end of this script where Sam Houston returns to Washington, D.C., and he's clad from head to toe in Cherokee Nation regalia as the ambassador to the Indian nations. Now remember, Sam Houston is a white American hero. So how would young Timmy, watching TV with his pa, explain how his hero was dressed like an Indian or an Injun? Right? How would this translate to the target audience at the time? I mean, could you even imagine a scene like this on American TV in 1957?
No, not as a pilot for a new show. It would have to be something that has already been established, something that has already been sold. Maybe that other show that we keep mentioning so often. You might have gotten away with it there. With a brand new series, this being the first episode, I don't think that was going to be allowed to happen.
And looking at my notes, I'm reading what I wanted to say next. And this is something that I think Earl, you and I both have a problem with this particular script. It was so hard to figure out what is going to be an observation and what is going to be a discussion point and what is going to be a moral meaning and message, because there is this, at the end of the episode, or the end of the script, I should say, there's a meeting between Andrew Jackson and Sam Houston. But the thing is that, as I said before, their first meeting that we saw, or would have seen, would have been in Destiny and the Raven, and that was in 1817. And in Exile, it takes place in 1830. And the exchange is this. And this is one of the things that we left with at the end. Sam Houston says, "When I fight for principles, sir." And then President Jackson says, "That's a precious commodity." And then Sam Houston replies, "I've noticed a lack of it in these parts." I think that my observations are leading towards something that I think you and I are going to get into a little bit later on in discussion regarding why not Sam Houston as a TV show.
Yeah, because he didn't always play nice with... He was within the law. I mean, throughout this story, he is within the law. He is within tribal law, and he is within federal law. But you get into that pesky territory about the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. Again, I have a feeling that there was a Screen Gems boardroom of pasty white guys reading these scripts and going, "Oh, hell, you want us to do what in prime time? You want us to sell this to who?"
And that goes into one of my last points here. So when I was reading the script, I was even a little kind of this is really interesting. I'm not sure how I feel about this. At the end of the script, Sam Houston is Sam Houston. But for the majority of the script, he burned his white clothes, he burned his white man boots, I should say, and he returned to the Cherokee Nation and became the Cherokee ambassador. We have an audience in 1957 who are used to white hats being good, black hats being bad, and good versus evil being as simple as that. My struggle with the end of the script here, is exactly what Gene is doing, placing racism and hatred towards the Indian nations in the form of the show's hero. Right? That's like the most deliciously subversive way of doing something I think I've ever seen, at least in his writing. Because going back to Timmy, hey Pa, this is my hero, but he's dressed like an Indian, right? So when you think about it, you're rooting for the hero who champions the cause of the so-called enemy, but he can't be the bad guy. I would love to have seen how people would have wrestled with this in 1957.
Yeah, because if Gene gets through to the audience about the plight of the Native Americans, with this line, again, does evil change with skin color? Who else might he be able to talk about next week if they give him a slot on the primetime schedule? Okay, Norman, we're back in Exile. I don't know if we actually had that many lighthearted observations, man. The observations got pretty heavy pretty quick.
I think the biggest challenge that I had with this script is to not overwrite my notes versus how many pages there were in the script. Because there's just something very affecting about the quality of the script and the historical significance of what's being said, as we've referenced, earlier on in observations about how many times Gene may have used the actual attributed quotes of Sam Houston's along with his own, along with Gene Roddenberry's own ideas, I should say. There's a voiceover at the end of page 6 of the script, going into page 7, that continues Gene's through line about Houston's honor that I found so compelling to read, because what we're looking at here is kind of like probably like the formulation of the prototype hero for Gene's work, either now or in the future, especially in the future. So, quote, "In all of American history, few reputations have seemed so completely destroyed. Sick at heart, disillusioned, Houston headed west. Only one thing left, an unyielding belief in his firm conception of honor. Misfortune could alter Houston's future, but never her personal code." So that was at the beginning of this script. Now, after reading this a few times, and with presumably some of Gene's handwritten notes to change around the narrator's dialogue to give it more gravitas, I think that, and Earl, you may feel the same way. I'm not sure how, I don't have a lot of, obviously, specific credit for this, but I think that Sam Houston was more to Gene than just a historical figure. I feel that there was something very personal to Gene about this man. Maybe it's his connection to Houston's morality. Maybe it's his integrity, how it allowed him to make this relationship, bridge these relationships with the Indian nations and the tribes to bring them all together and talk to their differences. I mean, does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, it does. And I really wonder if Gene had been enveloping himself in the story of Sam Houston from an early age, because Gene was born in El Paso. He was a Texan native himself. And so, sort of like what I was saying off mic earlier about myself being a native of Fort Smith, Arkansas, you get the local history in addition to the national history when you get into school. And I wonder how much of that was already with him when he landed this assignment, or if all of it just came from the research that he did here.
So, Earl, as you may have noticed, and maybe the audience has noticed as well, before we got to this discussion segment, we were alluding about why or why not Sam Houston wasn't made, for whatever reason, for specific reasons that we believe, and we're just basically making these assumptions based on what we know. And I wanted to ask you, was Sam Houston, based on the 2 scripts that we've read so far, too hot for television? And I want to bring us through a history lesson that leads me up to this question. So, there's a scene in Uluteka's tribal council chamber early on when Tucky, the Pawnee, that we met first in Destiny and the Raven says, quote, "Many winters ago, when we signed the treaty and gave up much land, the white man promised us many things. But instead of those things, blankets and cattle and guns for hunting, he has sent us white agents who grow rich on the goods promised us. Does Colonne, the Cherokee, counsel us to starve or to make war?" Now, this brings up an interesting follow-up to our theory as to why the series was not produced or passed on by network executives. Did they believe that when further examining Gene's early script proposals, like Destiny and the Raven and now this Exile, that they may have thought his stories were too pro-Indian and too anti-white?
I think that's a very real possibility. And again, repeating this one line that really stuck out to me. Does evil change with skin color, my father? If Gene is going to put before a primetime audience in 1957 or 58 the notion that the white man is not always right, he is making it look like he's talking about white settlers' history with Native Americans, but other things were happening historically at the time. The civil rights movement was gaining steam day by day. If Gene can put forth the idea that maybe the white man isn't always right when it came to matters with Native Americans, what's the next thing that he's going to put into one of his scripts? Is he going to say that maybe the white man's not right dealing with other ethnicities? Could you sell that to advertisers? Could you sell that to a network? Do you have a boardroom full of old middle-aged white guys who have just read this script going, oh, hell no? I really think perhaps here we are running into why this show never got made. It's too progressive. It's too subversive. It's not... By the time Gene is setting the foundations for Star Trek, his subversiveness has taken on kind of a slightly different character. We're not making a big deal about Uhura being on the bridge. She's just there. And she is an officer. We don't have to give her backstory. We don't have to tell you how she got the job. We'll leave that for someone decades from now to tell. She's just there. Sulu at the helm. You know, wait a minute. Weren't we just at war with Japan? And now there's a Japanese man on the bridge of this future starship? Well, yes, because we got over that. Because that was centuries in the past. No explanation required. We get better at it. Now, that's the part that we in real life keep failing, but I'll talk about that later. But the point is, the subversiveness in Star Trek is kind of slipped under the radar a bit. This is much more confrontational. Gene's being more confrontational. He's being in your face with it. It could be that this is where he got a hard lesson in maybe sugarcoating the message that he was wanting to slip to the audience.
And also, in this period of time, let's not forget that in the late 1950s, as we saw with I Led Three Lives, which he also wrote for, America at this time, in the late 1950s, is under the microscope of, the infamous Senator Joe McCarthy, the one that led the House Un-American Activities Committee, the one that set forth witch hunts for, communist subversives, especially, the famous blacklist of Hollywood. So I think you and I are maybe on the same page of believing that anti-American sympathies would be under a very similar level of scrutiny across the board, especially a pro-Indian, anti-white American angle that may be speculated by the industry in television as being too controversial for advertisers to back. I mean, let's be honest, right? If you're not going to get advertising dollars, you're not going to be making your show. And you don't want to risk advertisers for the future saying like, oh, aren't these the people that were kind of like, sympathetic to XYZ people? Because we don't want to advertise with them like ever. So yeah, that's part of the first part of my theory. The second part of my theory, and this is just sheer speculation on my part, based on the culture of the time of the late 1950s, But there's also a historical relevance, when this chapter of Sam Houston's life took place in 1829, and how it ran parallel to the American Indian travesty that was called the Trail of Tears, which began in 1830. On the History Channel's website, their article documenting the Trail of Tears states, at the beginning of the 1830s, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived on millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida, land their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. But by the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. Working on behalf of white settlers who wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land, the federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walk hundreds of miles to a specially designated, quote-unquote, Indian territory across the Mississippi River. This difficult and oftentimes deadly journey is known as the Trail of Tears. This is the story that Gene's telling, right now.
Yes.
I mean, he specifically says it took place in 1829, and when he met with General, at one time now President Andrew Jackson, it is 1930. So, let's get to General Jackson in this. What was General Jackson's role of all this? He was the president, at this time. According to the same article, Andrew Jackson had long been an advocate of what he recalled Indian removal. As an Army general, he had spent years leading brutal campaigns against the Creeks in Georgia and Alabama and the Seminoles in Florida, campaigns that resulted in the transfer of hundreds of thousands of acres of land from Indian nations to white farmers. Now, this is my note. Isn't it interesting, Earl, that the two scripts that we've read so far from Gene, Destiny the Raven dealt with Jackson in the Florida territories and Sam Houston defending the rights of Indians, the Seminole and the Cherokee, underneath the military auspices of Jackson's, quote-unquote, corralling of Indian, slaves or criminals. And then the next script, and the last script that we see here in Exile, is Jackson literally almost, at the forefront of creating the Trail of Tears, situation, the tragedy that happened to the Indians. So as president, he continued this crusade. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the federal government the power to exchange native-held land in the Cotton Kingdom east of the Mississippi for land in the West, in the Indian colonization zone that the United States had acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase. This Indian territory was located in present-day Oklahoma. Without going further into the argument that Gene was obviously trying to tell not just a historical story, but a moral and human story, we're dealing with something that you and I think, are very personally connected with, because now we literally are living in the areas where these stories are taking place. And I think that you have a very interesting perspective on this.
Yeah, and because I was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and as I mentioned before, sort of like Gene may have encountered in his youth in Texas, you get local history as well as national history when you go to school. And growing up in and around Fort Smith, Arkansas, you got to hear a lot about Judge Isaac C. Parker, the hanging judge, and how supposedly great it was that he convicted and sent so many people to their deaths. But there is another side to that story, and the funny thing is, Fort Smith being on the border between Arkansas and Oklahoma, you don't have to go very far to hear the other side of that story. You just got to go over the Garrison Avenue Bridge, and you're in Sequoyah County. I also had a family member who worked at a tribal information center in Sequoyah County. This is where it gets kind of embarrassing, because she immersed herself in the Native American lore so much that she went and created a whole new identity for herself. We have noted in the past something similar was done by Jamake Highwater, who sold himself to numerous film and television productions in the 80s and 90s, including Star Trek Voyager, as a Native American expert. That's where it gets a little bit uncomfortable. That's why I'm glad you are the one who has looked up the real non-TV history for this episode and not me, because I have extremely conflicted feelings. And one thing I don't have conflicted feelings about is that the Trail of Tears was a staggering humanitarian tragedy that should never have been allowed to happen. It definitely colors Andrew Jackson's legacy. And it has been pointed out in some of our Facebook comments that later on, Sam Houston himself was a slave owner. So, not the perfect paragon of virtue that Gene almost seems to be trying to invent here. So, either there's a bit of cherry picking going on, or, possibly that and Gene's own worldview was still evolving. But still, it seems to me like he had some stuff to work out of his system with this script in a big way.
Now, knowing what Gene knew not only about Sam Houston, but about his dual identity as both white military agent and the adopted son of the Cherokee Nation, specifically Chief Uluteka, here's the question. Is it plausible to believe that Gene was in fact trying to convey a very specific message about the plight of the American Indian as a people under the pretense of a story of a bona fide American hero? And doesn't this sound familiar? Our job, Earl, for the mission log Gene-ology mission is to find the DNA that links Gene Roddenberry's earlier work to his most famous work. And not to, pardon the pun, but using the phrase a show that's not in the too distant future of this point of his career, where he employs science fiction as a mean to tell stories that reflect on specific issues of, wait for it, race, war, poverty, strife, cultural division, and deep humanistic dynamics. In that very same subversive way in, the Destiny and the Raven and Exile, we see that happen, that the network didn't realize at the time. His subversion in these scripts is very, very subtle if you're not paying attention to what he's actually writing. Do you think that what he was counting on when it came to the networks?
Almost certainly. I think we are getting a very clear picture of what kind of stories Gene wanted to tell and why he wanted to tell them. And that's the really important part of the dynamic. And I think what we are seeing here, what the whole story of his writing career so far has been, is he is trying on different genres of TV storytelling to see what he can get away with. Can he get away with this in a cop show? Mental Patient, for example, seemed to be very much in the minority of that kind of story in Highway Patrol. Could he get away with it in a military show like West Point? Well, probably not with representatives of the actual West Point vetting his scripts. Okay, so now we are going to try on the Western and see if it fits. And see if we can tell these kinds of stories, slip these kind of messages in, and get away with it.
Now, to be completely honest, even reading the script today in April of 2024, some of the interactions between Sam Houston and the U.S. military, that were in charge of the Indian affairs at Fort Smith, you had Powers, and you had Burke, and you had Barrington. Burke, even reading it in script form from 1957, it was extremely distressing and made me feel the same kind of shame I felt at the end of Dance with Wolves or at the end of Last of the Mohicans. And just to kind of wrap up, the theory crafting here in terms of why not Sam Houston, why wasn't this produced? Is it perhaps what Gene was writing here also just too emotionally charged for the audience of the time? I mean, when you really think about the numbers, the Trail of Tears was only a little over 100 years, before this series would have taken place. Addressing this in the context of TV, as the kids say today, was it too soon to bring up those feelings again? Or, more importantly, were those feelings ever gone?
I don't think those feelings were ever gone, and more to the point, I think what Gene was trying to do here was he was trying to bring up talking points to do with Selma and Montgomery in the guise of making it a story about Indians and the Army clashing in Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was never about Fort Smith, Arkansas. It was never about cowboys and Indians. This was about something else entirely. And again, you need only go back to that line, does evil change with skin color, to really understand what Gene was trying to put across. And yeah, I don't think it was too soon. I think it was too current, at least by the estimation of the people holding the purse strings. All right, Norman, as we do, we've discussed it, we have observed it, we've taken it in. The really sad thing is that after this podcast, this script goes back to a filing cabinet. But as we always do, we look for the messages, morals, and meanings that Gene may have been trying to leave in his work for anyone who saw it, or in our case, anyone who read it, which again is an unfortunately low number. What do you think you found here, sir?
Well, there's something that I want to reference from an episode of Star Trek that I dearly love. I think it's one of the best written episodes of Star Trek of all time, and it's Far Beyond the Stars from Deep Space Nine. It's the end where Avery Brooks says, Benny Russell says, you cannot destroy an idea. That is arcane knowledge. You cannot destroy an idea. What I love about that line, and how it's referenced sometimes in Batman movies, Batman is an idea. He's not a man. Where am I going with this, folks? I believe, to Gene Roddenberry, that Sam Houston was more than a man. I believe that he thought that Sam Houston was an ideal. And variations on the theme of this heroic ideal. And we'll see this later in various different themes and iterations of his primary lead characters in his future work. The way I see it, the way I reason this is because in Act 1, there's a scene. Earl, you referenced this earlier in Observations, and it's when the major Indian nations gather with Chief Uluteka to figure out what to do regarding the failure of the U.S. government's promises of supplies and aid. Tucky is one of the Pawnee representatives there, and kind of like one of the adversaries of Sam Houston's in between these two scripts. And he says, the Pawnee have need of counsel, too. But we have traveled to hear the words of the chief, Uluteka, not of one who hides his white skin in the dress of a Cherokee. Uluteka says, and you've referenced this many times, because it's very important in this script. Uluteka says, touching his son Sam Houston's arm, God painted all hearts in the same color. My son, Colone, the raven, has walked straight. His path is not crooked. He is beloved by all my people. Tucky responds, you call him your son. Others call him Houston. Can a man walk two paths? Later in the script, Sam Houston says to Tucky, Colone has killed many enemies in war, but to kill without reason is evil. And then, in probably the most important conversation with Uluteka, again, Earl, you have brought this up many times, does evil change with skin color, my father? These are just excerpts of what I believe is one of Gene's most exemplary scripts that he has written that sets the path of the DNA of his future writing. This script, in every sense of the word, for me, this script is a treasure because it is so densely packed with so many moral moments. And I think I mentioned this earlier. Essentially, we're bearing witness to not just what is an interpretation of Sam Houston's exploits, but also the creation of one of Gene Roddenberry's most defining ideals, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. One of Gene's most famous quotes, and one of my personal favorites, is, quote, if a man is to survive, he will have to learn to take delight in the essential differences between men and between cultures. He will learn that differences in ideas and attitudes are a delight, part of life's exciting variety, not something to fear. This is on display in this episode, especially where Sam Houston is fighting for not just the rights of the Indian affairs, but for the understanding of those said affairs and the greater complication of what it means to be an American. Where these people fall in line with the rights that they are supposed to have established with the government. That is unfortunate that we won't see this developed any further. Another line that I felt that was very applicable to how Gene feels about Sam Houston in his writing and how he manifests it is from Dr. Boyce to Captain Pike in The Cage. I have to believe this was also inspired by his adoration of Sam Houston. Dr. Boyce said, "A man either lives life as it happens to him, meets it head on and licks it, or he turns his back on it and starts to wither away." So, at least from my perspective, you can see that there's definitely a through line here that Gene has established for his narrative tone and a morality for his main characters that will feature later in series that he wrote for and series that he created. Paladin, William T. Rice, Christopher Pike, and eventually James T. Kirk all share this very specific DNA that I believe started with Gene's fundamental understanding of how Sam Houston, this very real man from real history, became who he was and changed the course of human history because he simply and unwaveringly believed in his principles. That's what I get from two scripts, Earl. That's what I get from Gene's his passion for this character, but also I think in the belief and ideals of a very real man. And it's rare to see that so immediately, from a writer in these first opening works, of what was supposed to be a much larger production. But it was very moving to me going through these scripts. I feel very privileged to be a part of the process of actually seeing these, reading these for the first time, and actually having a discussion about them on air for the first time in the history of what we're doing and of Gene's work. So I want to thank you for that, for the opportunity. And I guess I should ask in return, how did you feel about the script?
Well, sort of my glib answer is that this script it's almost too much for half an hour of television. It's too much for an hour of television. And this is the best 47-page movie script I've ever read, because it feels like it needs that much scope, that much canvas to be told. Whether you tell the story in concert with Destiny and the Raven, or let it stand on its own just as Exile. One other line that was put in the mouth of Andrew Jackson jumped out at me as almost like a warning to the future. Jackson tells Sam Houston, "This nation's like a young bull. Right now it's got more strength than sense." This is like the political version of, boys will be boys, which is a phrase that needs to be retired from common usage yesterday. This is Gene writing in 1957 or 58 about events in 1829 and 1830, and yet it still applies now. And you wonder why a boardroom of guys at Screen Gems was nervous about giving this the green light and putting it on the air. I think that's why. But Gene was trying to slip it under the radar by making it seem like this is a story about something way back then, but it's actually about now. And so you kind of get the impression that once Gene felt he had exhausted his energy with the Western genre, he tried to come back to present day to do his kind of writing. We'll find out how that went for him. It didn't go great. And so he decided to make the next project a period piece in the opposite direction. Let's go into the far future and talk about this stuff. And instead of addressing the civil rights movement by way of bringing up what a lot of people consider old business with the Indian nations, let's make everyone have antennae sprouting out of their head, or pointed ears, or things on their forehead, or they're just slightly swarthier than the average person, and we call them Klingons. But it's still about now. It's still about these problems we have now. And the thing about that line, this nation's like a young bull. Right now it's got more strength than sense. Unfortunately, that is still us now. When the hell do we finally grow up and have more sense? Because it doesn't seem like it's on the agenda for the immediate future. When do we stop endlessly repeating the same mistakes? Because they were being made in the 1820s and 1830s. They were being made in the 1950s. They're still in vogue now. They're back in fashion. They never left. It's unfortunate. Mission Log Gene-ology is produced by Roddenberry Entertainment. Special thanks to the Roddenberry Repertory Players. Our cast this week featured Cody Banning as Sam Houston, Robert Parson as Secretary Burnett, and yours truly as Major Barrington. If you would like to support us directly, you can do so at patreon.com/missionlog for early access to shows and the Mission Log Discord. If you have any material that might be of interest to us that isn't already in the Roddenberry archive, drop us a line at missionlog@roddenberry.com. Our website is missionlogpodcast.com.
On the next Gene-ology, have gun, will travel. Special thanks to consulting producers Matt Esposito, Homer Frizzell, Julie Miller, Mike Richards, Mike Schabel, Paul Shadwell, and David Takechi.
We'll be back next week with more of your favorite programs. This concludes our broadcast day.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.